Marisol Quintero was paid to clean Ruslan Vargas' house, not to save his life, and everybody inside St. Adalbert's Church that morning understood the difference. She was 27 years old, born in Kensington, with a burn scar along her left collarbone that she'd stopped explaining to people years ago, and hands that hadn't been soft since she was 19. She wasn't anybody, that was the whole point of her. She stood at the back with the rest of the staff, while 200 people filled the pews for the 10th anniversary of Sandor Vargas' death, 6 families from 3 states, and 40 men carrying something heavier than rosaries under their coats. At the front stood the man they'd all come for. Ruslan Varga was 34, gray-eyed, and he ran the Philadelphia waterfront the way weather runs a coastline, quietly and without asking permission. His right hand was missing a joint on the little finger, and nobody had ever worked up the nerve to ask why. He'd never raised his voice in his life. He'd never needed to. And in about 90 seconds, he was going to lift a glass of red wine toward his father's photograph, drink it down the way he'd done every November for 10 years, and die on the drive home from a heart attack that no coroner in Pennsylvania would ever think to question. Marisol knew that. She was the only person in the building who did. 4 months earlier, she'd overheard 3 broken pieces of a phone call through a door left open about an inch, and the third piece was a single word that meant nothing to anyone in that church except a woman who'd spent 3 years in nursing school before the money ran out. She'd warned him. He'd listened with his arms folded, and then he'd told her, very gently, that in his world men don't poison the people they eat dinner with. Now the priest was finishing, now the wine was poured, now a server she'd seen exactly once before. A nervous man with a hospital visitor band still on his wrist was crossing the marble floor with a silver tray and 1 glass on it, and his eyes were locked on Ruslan Varga with an intensity that had nothing to do with serving wine. There wasn't time to shout. There wasn't time to explain. There wasn't time for anything but the oldest instinct a person has. So Marisol Quintero, house cleaner, daughter of a dead longshoreman, ran across a church full of the most dangerous men on the East Coast, and she slapped the boss of the Varga family across the face hard enough that the sound cracked through the nave like a gunshot. The glass left his hand. It shattered on the stone. Red spread through the pieces, and in the silence that followed, 40 men reached inside their coats at exactly the same moment, because in that room, putting your hand on that man's face wasn't disrespect. It was a death sentence that had already been signed. What happened over the next 2 hours would tear the Varga family apart, put a man in federal prison, and give 300 families back something that had been stolen from them for years. But right then, standing in a church with her hand still stinging, Marisol didn't know any of that. She only knew the lab was about to test the wine, and if she was wrong, she'd never walk out of that building. If you're enjoying this so far, hit that like button. It really does help. Share it with somebody who'd appreciate a story like this one, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a hallway on the 3rd floor, 4 months before that slap, when a woman carrying a tea tray heard something through a door that was open just a little too far. 4 months before the morning at the church, on a July afternoon so sweltering that the air inside the Society Hill house felt heavy as water, Marisol Quintero climbed to the 3rd floor to retrieve the tea tray she had forgotten the day before. That was all. A silver tray, a cup of cold tea with a skin formed across its surface, and the habit of never leaving anything dirty overnight in the house she was paid to care for. She rarely went up to the 3rd floor. It was the floor of closed doors, of walnut and furniture polish, of a silence so dense that she had learned to pass through it without making a sound. She had worked there for less than 2 months, and during those 2 months she had learned that silence in that house wasn't the absence of sound. It was something with weight. It was something people built and protected. The study door stood open by perhaps half an inch. It wasn't open. It was merely ajar in the way a door remained when someone closed it without pulling it completely shut because they believed no one else was left in the house. And through that narrow opening, a voice speaking into a telephone handset drifted out. She recognized it immediately. Emmett Kovash had the kind of voice people didn't forget. It was warm. It was slow. It was the voice of a man who had never needed to fight for his turn to speak, because every room had always fallen silent on its own the moment he began. And between his sentences came a small sound, steady and almost pleasant, the click of a peppermint tapping against his teeth. Marisol had seen him take candies from his coat pocket many times. He always offered her one. She always declined politely. The silver tray was cold beneath her fingertips, the familiar chill of metal. She would remember that detail for the rest of her life, because it was the last thing belonging to the ordinary world that she could still feel. Then the first fragment drifted through the crack in the door. After the boy finishes reading the eulogy, Marisol didn't stop. Not entirely. Something inside her faltered for half a beat. The kind of half beat a person only noticed after it had already passed. Because there was only one boy in that house. And that boy was 34 years old, gray-eyed, with 40 men prepared to do anything he asked without questioning him once. Then came the second fragment. The wine glass at the altar. He drains it every year. He won't think. This time, she truly stopped. She stood motionless in the middle of the hallway, and something in her mind began to turn very slowly, like the gears of an old machine being oiled after years of neglect. She knew about that glass of wine. Everyone in the house knew. Every November, before the photograph of the man who had been shot in broad daylight while no one agreed to testify, the son raised the glass and drank it empty. It wasn't the ritual of a family. It was the ritual of a promise. And Emmett Kovac had just spoken of it in the voice someone might use to discuss where a table should be placed for the convenience of the guests. Marisol leaned closer. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the price of being caught listening behind a door in that house, understood it better than most, because she had spent 2 months watching the men who came and went, and had learned that none of them needed to raise his voice to make something disappear. Still, she leaned in, because something in that voice had begun to turn her skin cold, and she needed to know why. Then the third fragment drifted out, and it was only one word: monkshood, just enough for one glass of wine. To anyone else in that house, to the gardener, to the driver, to any one of those 40 men, monkshood was only a flower. The purple kind people planted along fences because it looked beautiful in summer, a name that sounded as though it belonged in a seed catalog. But Marisol Quintero had spent 3 years sitting in nursing lectures before the money ran out, and that word didn't enter her ears as the name of a flower. It entered like a shadow. It carried with it an autumn afternoon from many years before, a lecture hall, an instructor standing before a board and speaking so calmly that the whole class had laughed, saying that the most beautiful thing in your garden could sometimes be the most dangerous. She had stopped laughing before anyone else in the room that day. The silver tray was still cold beneath her fingers. She didn't move. She barely breathed. Inside the study, that warm voice continued, slow and comfortable, rolling a peppermint against his palate between pauses, the voice of a man discussing the weekend weather. Then came the sound of a chair scraping backward across the wooden floor. Marisol retreated, one step, then another, into the darkness behind the tall bookcase at the end of the hallway, and stood there with the tray pressed tightly against her chest so it wouldn't make a sound, her heart pounding so violently that she was certain it would betray her. The door didn't open. Footsteps moved toward the window. The voice continued. She waited until both her legs had gone numb, then descended the stairs without making a sound, carrying the silver tray and something she would never be able to give back. That night, she sat for a long time on the edge of the bed in her small room on the lowest floor, staring at her hands and making the only calculation she could make. July, November, 4 months. That was all she had. 4 months, a silver tray, and 3 fragments of a telephone conversation she had never been meant to hear. No evidence, not a single name. Nothing but a word that sounded like the name of a flower, and a memory that refused to forget. And in that house, she was the woman who scrubbed the floors. She was wise enough to understand what that meant. She had 4 months, and no one would believe her. To understand why a woman who scrubbed floors would sit on the edge of her bed all night, too afraid to report what she knew to anyone. You first had to understand who the man she meant to save truly was. And before that, you had to understand the man who had brought him into the world. Sandor Varga arrived in Port Richmond from Hungary with a set of welding tools and not a single word of English in his head, then spent most of his life in a basement apartment so damp that the walls sweated in winter. He wasn't a boss. He had never been a boss. He was a welder with 2 scorched hands and the dangerous habit of not knowing how to bow his head. On the docks in those days, when a cargo handler had his leg crushed by a container, the company gave him taxi fare home and wished him good luck. Sandor Varga believed that was wrong. Not the kind of wrong a man complained about in a tavern before going home to sleep. It was the kind of wrong that made him rise in the middle of a union meeting and say aloud what everyone in the room was thinking but no one dared to speak. Then he said it again. Then he said it once more. Every week, every month, until his name became a problem that needed to be solved. Ruslan was 24 on that day. It was a clear September afternoon, and his father was walking across a supermarket parking lot, carrying 2 paper bags of groceries, in broad daylight, among dozens of people pushing shopping carts, opening trunks, and calling their children back to the car. It happened very quickly. It always happened very quickly. Later, the police counted nearly 20 people who had been standing close enough to see everything. Not one of them said a word. It wasn't because they were cruel. Ruslan came to understand that later, and it was that understanding that ate away at him. They weren't cruel, they simply had children to take to school, rent to pay, and small, fragile lives. They weren't wealthy enough to gamble for a dead man who wouldn't return no matter what they said. The case remained open for a few months, then it was closed. No suspect, no witness, nothing at all. And inside the basement apartment, whose walls sweated in winter, the son sat alone with the knowledge life had just handed him, the only lesson it intended to teach. Justice didn't come on its own. It wasn't waiting somewhere in the world to be given to those who behaved with enough decency. A man who wanted justice had to forge it for himself. With his own hands, from whatever metal he could find, at whatever price had to be paid. And Ruslan Varga forged it. In the span of time, an ordinary man might need to pay off a house and replace a car. He rose from a dock crew to controlling the gates of the harbor, then the unions, then the routes through which the goods of an entire region had to pass. He did things he never told anyone about. He did them quietly. People said he ruled the waters of Philadelphia the way weather ruled a coastline, and that description was more accurate than the people who used it understood, because no one had ever heard Ruslan Varga raise his voice. He didn't need to. By the age of 34, he owned a 4-story house in Society Hill with more rooms than he had ever entered. And he slept on the sofa in the study because, as a child, he had slept beneath the dining table, and his body had never relearned how to stretch out on a wide bed without feeling exposed beneath an open sky. But the thing people spoke about most in South Philadelphia wasn't the harbor, and it wasn't the house. It was the fund. He established it in his first year and placed his father's name upon it. The rule was only 1 line long. Anyone who worked on the docks, if his wife was in the hospital, if his child needed an operation, if he himself had a leg crushed beneath a container, could fill out a form and submit it. No income assessment, no interest, no questions about why, no repayment, ever. There were kitchens in that neighborhood, kitchens with peeling wallpaper and a crucifix hanging above the refrigerator, where a visitor might see a newspaper photograph pinned beside the image of a saint. And in that photograph was the gray-eyed man who never smiled for a camera. No one in those kitchens asked where the money in the fund came from. People didn't ask questions when their children were allowed to keep breathing. A woman named Odile had cared for the Society Hill house for 20 years, from long before it belonged to him. One morning she simply didn't come, leaving behind only a handwritten letter explaining that her knees could no longer manage the stairs and apologizing for not giving notice. That afternoon, he arranged a lifetime allowance for her and never asked another question. His right hand was missing the final joint of the little finger, and through all those years, no one had ever been brave enough to ask why. That was the man sitting in the study on that sweltering July afternoon, only 1 hallway away from the bookcase behind which Marisol had hidden herself. He could read a contract as thick as a book and point to the exact place where someone had buried the trap. He could read the gun beneath another man's coat from across the room, from the fold of the fabric, from the way the man stood. He could read a lying face so quickly that the liar often hadn't finished speaking. He had simply never learned how to read kindness, because to recognize something, a person had to have seen enough of it to know what it resembled. And throughout Ruslan Varga's entire life, no one had ever treated him kindly without wanting to take something away. The woman hiding behind that bookcase had learned the very same lesson as Ruslan Varga, except she had learned it 5 years before he did, and she had learned it inside a building in Kensington whose fire alarm had been broken for nearly a year. The landlord knew. He had received violation notices, more than once, and he had sat down and made the calculation men like him always made, comparing the cost of repairs with the cost of the fine, and he chose the fine because the fine was cheaper. That was the whole story. It was always the whole story. Marisol was 19 years old on that night, the 14th of March, and she had just returned from a 12-hour shift, carrying the kind of exhaustion that had seeped into her bones and no longer rested merely on her skin. Rosita was 6 and afraid of the dark. She always left her bedroom door open by a narrow crack, always asked her sister to stay a little longer, always had one more question, one more story, one more reason not to close her eyes. That night, the child was restless. She called for her sister. Then she called again, and Marisol, 19 years old, with aching legs, aching hands, and a mind emptied by 12 hours on her feet, Did the thing every person in this world has done at least once to someone they loved. She lost her patience. She closed the door. And the final words her sister heard from her were 5 simple words. "Sleep now. I'm so tired." Then she went to bed. What happened afterward didn't need to be told again. They managed to carry the little girl outside, but her lungs never recovered. Their father didn't make it out. He had gone back inside. They told Marisol that he had gone back, and that was all she ever knew about the final minutes of her father's life. A sentence spoken by a stranger in uniform, and she carried it with her for the rest of her days. Her mother escaped, bringing with her 2 permanently damaged lungs and a machine that would remain beside her until the end of her life. And Rosita slept for the next 8 years in a place with windows overlooking a row of trees. The trial took place that autumn. Marisol sat in the back row wearing the only coat she owned, and listened as they read the sentence given to the man who had chosen the fine because the fine was cheaper. A sum of money equal to the price of an old car, and probation. She remembered sitting motionless for a long time after everyone else had risen. She remembered waiting for something, a voice, an outcry. Someone to stand and say that this wasn't right. Nothing came. People gathered their papers. They called the next case. That entire courtroom had treated her father's life and her sister's 8 years of sleep as a line in a ledger, and then they had turned the page. That was the day Marisol Quintero learned that justice didn't come on its own. It was exactly the lesson another child had learned inside a basement apartment in Port Richmond. And the strange thing was that the 2 of them, separated by only a few miles and an entire world, had learned it in almost the same way. There was only one difference. He answered by forging justice for himself out of metal and fear, and he built an empire upon it. She answered by enrolling in nursing school, because, in her understanding, the thing that had destroyed her family wasn't an evil man. It was helplessness. It was that moment when someone stood there and didn't know what to do, and she swore to herself that never again, not once for the rest of her life, would she stand and watch someone who needed saving while having no idea how to save them. She studied for 3 years. She was good at it. Then her mother needed a machine that ran day and night, and her sister needed a bed in a place with windows overlooking a row of trees, and together those 2 things cost more than any 24-year-old woman could earn. That year, she worked nights at Belmead Nursing Home. Her mother's medication ran out, the insurance company refused to cover it, and during a shift at 3 o'clock in the morning, Marisol Quintero opened medication drawer number 4 and took something that didn't belong to her. She didn't sell it. She didn't make a single cent from it. She carried it home to the woman who had given birth to her. The camera recorded everything. She was fired that morning. Charges were filed that afternoon. And the door slammed shut forever, in a way she didn't yet fully understand at the time. Because the state licensing board wouldn't grant a nursing license to someone with a conviction of that kind. Ever. No exceptions. The degree she was only 4 months away from completing, still lying in the drawer of her desk, was no longer a matter of money. It was a locked door, and someone had thrown the key into the river. She washed dishes. She scrubbed floors. She worked nights in places where people didn't ask too many questions. And every month, she paid 2 bills, one for the machine and one for the bed, and she was never even a single day late. In the years that followed, people told her many times that the door she had closed that night wouldn't have changed anything. Doctors told her. A priest told her. Even her own mother, during the days when her memory was still clear, told her the same thing. Marisol nodded every time. She thanked them every time. And she never believed it for a single day of her life. The places where people didn't ask too many questions, as it turned out, were the places that stayed open all night. And in the spring of the year she turned 27, Marisol Quintero was pushing a mop across the emergency room waiting area at Jefferson Hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning. That was the hour when an emergency room became the most honest place in the city. Everyone who came through those sliding doors carried something that was truly broken. She had cleaned that floor through enough nights to read each person by the way they entered. And when the sliding doors opened that night, she looked up and knew at once that what had just walked in was unlike anything she had ever seen. The man was tall, gray-eyed, and dressed in a suit that cost more than she earned in an entire year, and there was blood on his right sleeve that didn't belong to him. He was carrying a boy who couldn't have been 20 yet. His face drained white, one hand pressed against his side. The man wasn't panicking. That was the first thing Marisol noticed, and it was what sent a chill down her spine. When people carried someone into an emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning, they panicked. He didn't. He walked straight to the desk and spoke in a very low voice. The woman behind the glass typed into her computer, then stopped, then said the words Marisol had heard hundreds of times in that place. No insurance, no identification, no name. She was very sorry. And Marisol saw what happened across the man's face with perfect clarity, because nothing happened at all. His face didn't redden. He didn't clench his jaw. He simply placed both hands on the counter, very slowly, and tilted his head slightly, the way a person tilted his head while deciding where to begin. In that moment, Marisol knew what was about to happen, and she also knew that when it was over, no one would have examined the boy. So she set down the mop. She walked to the desk. She didn't push the man aside. She merely stepped into the empty space beside him as though that space had always belonged to her, and spoke without raising her voice, in the same steady tone she used when reading room numbers to the orderlies. You're refusing triage, not admission. Triage. Federal law doesn't require insurance for triage. It requires a person who is still breathing. He's still breathing, right now. Then she fell silent. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize for interfering. She stood there with floor water still wet on her hands and waited. The woman behind the glass looked at her. Then she picked up the phone. Less than a minute later, a stretcher came through the doors, and the boy was taken inside. Ruslan Varga stood motionless in the middle of the waiting room, staring at the woman in the gray janitor's uniform. In all the years he had spent forging justice for himself, he had watched people win with money, with fear, with a name spoken at the right moment. He had never, not even once, watched anyone win with the truth. He asked her name. She gave it to him, then returned to her mop, because her shift still had 2 hours left, and that floor wasn't going to clean itself. That night, he called Solomon Pike, not because he distrusted her, but because in the world he inhabited, looking into a person happened automatically, like breathing. The report arrived 2 days later, and it was thin. It contained 3 years of excellent work in nursing school, 2 monthly bills, and the name of a nursing home. Belmead, medication drawer number 4, 3 o'clock in the morning. The camera recorded everything. She hadn't sold it, hadn't made a single cent, had carried it straight home to her mother, and a door controlled by the state had been locked against her forever. Pike said that if the boss needed someone, he should let him find another file. Ruslan read the page once more, folded it, and said there was no need. He returned to Jefferson on another night without a suit, and waited until her shift ended. He told her he needed someone to care for his house, then named the salary. Marisol only looked at him without blinking. She didn't thank him. Do you sell the thing that killed my neighbors? No. Never have. Never will. If I find out you're lying, I leave that same night. If I'm lying, you should leave. She was silent for a moment, then asked the only question that truly mattered. Why would you hire someone with a criminal record? He looked at her for a long time. People with clean hands don't understand me. I hire people who have had to choose. On the night before she moved into the Society Hill house, Marisol sat beside her sister's bed in the place with windows overlooking a row of trees. She told Rosita about the new job, about the enormous house with all its rooms, about the salary she still couldn't quite believe, and she told it all in a light, cheerful voice, exactly the way she had spoken to her sister for the past 8 years, every week, without missing a single one. During her first 2 weeks in Society Hill, Ruslan Varga spoke fewer than 20 sentences to Marisol Quintero, most of them expressions of thanks. He came home late, left early, and closed the study door behind him. But she was the woman who scrubbed the floors, and the people who scrubbed floors saw everything, because no one bothered to hide anything in front of someone they believed wasn't truly there. She saw plates of food carried away untouched. She saw the light beneath the study door at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was still burning at 6. She saw him roll his right shoulder the way people did when a joint had been damaged long ago, and the body had learned to bargain with pain instead of healing it. She saw the bottle of painkillers emptying faster than the instructions printed on the label allowed. She said nothing, not because she was afraid, because there were doors a person had to wait for someone else to open, and knocking only made them turn the lock one more time. Then, one August afternoon, while clearing the table, she saw the stack of papers lying in front of him. It was the new health insurance package for everyone who worked on his docks. Hundreds of people with hundreds of families behind them. Emmett Kovac had drafted it. Emmett Kovac drafted everything. Ruslan was holding a pen. Marisol had no intention of reading it. She merely glanced at the pages as she lifted a plate, the instinctive glance of someone who had spent 3 years in lecture halls learning how to read the papers that decided whether a person would be allowed to keep breathing. And she stopped. She stood there holding the plate for so long that he looked up. Clause 14C excludes pre-existing chronic conditions. He looked at her. Do you know how many of those people have damaged spines or lungs filled with container dust? You walk through you see the way they step out of their cars. Then she set the plate down and said one final thing. This package looks like insurance, but it's a blank sheet of paper. Ruslan Varga remained silent for a long time. Then he put down the pen and made a call. Emmett Kovac entered the room in less than a minute, still holding a cup of coffee. After listening to everything, he did something a truly bad man would never have thought to do. He laughed. The smile was genuinely warm, without a single tightened muscle beneath it. He reread the clause, nodded thoughtfully, tapped the papers lightly, and said it was the broker's standard form, that they slipped that line into every contract, because that was their business, that he should have caught it, and that he was sorry. He didn't apologize to Ruslan. He turned to Marisol and apologized to her. Then he took out his pen, crossed out clause 14C, wrote the replacement language by hand in the margin, initialed it, and pushed the papers back toward Ruslan, as though the matter had cost him only 30 seconds, and the smallest inconvenience. Then he took a peppermint from his coat pocket, unwrapped it, and offered her one. She declined politely. He nodded, smiled again, and left. That was the first time Emmett Kovac truly looked at Marisol Quintero. Not the passing glance given to the woman carrying the tea tray. It was a different look, the look of a man who had just discovered that inside the house he had been entering since before Ruslan Varga could walk, there was a woman who scrubbed floors and could read what none of those 40 men had managed to see. He didn't appear displeased. He never appeared displeased. He simply remembered. From that day forward, a new habit quietly formed inside the house. Ruslan Varga began leaving contracts on the kitchen table. He didn't hand them to her. He didn't ask her to read them. He never said a word about it, not even once. He simply placed the papers on the table before he left. She would find them there when she came down to make coffee, and by the time the pot had finished brewing, a note would be attached to one of the pages, bearing a single handwritten line. Brief, never more than one sentence. Those notes continued throughout August, and Marisol began to believe she understood the house. Then, late one night near the end of the month, at around 11 o'clock, she heard a sound from the basement. The basement was the only place in the entire house she had been forbidden to enter, and that prohibition had been spoken only once, on her first day, in a voice so calm that she had understood immediately it wasn't a suggestion. She stood at the top of the stairs for a long time. The sound didn't come again. It had happened only once, and it was precisely that single sound that kept her from turning away. She went down. The steps were old wood, and she moved the way she always moved through the third-floor hallway, placing her feet near the edges, rather than in the center. There was only one hanging bulb below, and the smell of damp concrete. Ruslan Varga was sitting on a wooden chair, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows, and on that white fabric was something Marisol saw during the first half-second and then decided not to examine more closely, a decision she would keep for the rest of her life. Across from him, seated in another chair, was a man she had never met. She knew who he was. Everyone on the docks knew who he was. He was the lender from the corner on the south side, the man who had loaned a widow the money to bury her husband, a dock worker whose lungs had taken in too much of too many things over too many years, and then charged interest in such a way that by the 4th month the debt had grown larger than the house, and by the 6th month he took the house, legally, with documents, with her signature. Ruslan didn't shout. Marisol stood at the foot of the stairs and listened as he asked a question, and the question was so quiet that she had to strain to hear it. Then he waited. He waited the way a person waited for water to boil, without impatience, without looking at the clock, because the water would eventually boil, and both of them knew it. Then he looked up. He met her eyes directly. He knew how long she had been standing there, and he didn't stop. He merely asked, still in that same voice, "Do you want to go upstairs, or do you want to stay?" Marisol Quintero had lived 27 years in a city that had taught her early that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. She didn't go upstairs. She stood at the foot of the stairs and stayed, and she watched. And later, whenever anyone asked what she had seen that night, she always answered with the same sentence, that she had watched a man work very slowly and very patiently, and that it was the most frightening thing she had ever witnessed, because a man who was angry would eventually stop being angry, but a patient man never ran out of patience. Nearly an hour later, upstairs in the kitchen with the lights still burning, Ruslan washed his hands at the sink for a very long time. Marisol didn't ask anything. She poured a glass of water and set it in front of him, then spoke in the same steady voice she always used, a voice that was never louder than necessary. "You put him in the hospital. In a few months, he'll heal. Then he'll open another lending book on another corner 3 blocks away, with a different name above the door, and there'll be another widow who needs money to bury her husband. You haven't stopped anything. You've only slowed it down." Ruslan dried his hands with the towel hanging beside the sink. He didn't look at her. "Then what do you want me to do?" And Marisol gave him the answer she had spent the entire hour at the foot of the stairs thinking about. Buy the house outright. Give it back to her. Pay off the debt. Give her the papers and a new lock. That costs more, and it's harder, and it takes longer, and no one in this city will ever know you did it. You chose the other way because it was easy, and because it made you feel powerful. In that kitchen, on that night near the end of August, for the first time in all 34 years of his life, someone told Ruslan Varga that violence was the path of a lazy man. Not that it was wrong, not that it was evil, that it was lazy, that it was what people chose when they didn't want to give more of themselves. He stood perfectly still. The towel remained in his hand. Then he set it down, very neatly, folded in half along the edge of the sink, and walked out of the kitchen without saying a word. The glass of water remained untouched on the table when she cleaned up at midnight. He never mentioned it again. Not that night, not the following morning, not once during all the weeks that came after. And Marisol didn't mention it either. Then, 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon while traveling to visit her mother, she passed through the south side because the bus route had changed that day. And on the small front porch of a house with red brick steps, she saw an older woman holding a hose and watering several potted plants in the afternoon sun, slippers on her feet, a scarf tied around her hair, watering flowers outside her own home. Marisol stood across the street for a while. Then she continued walking. No one ever said anything to her about it, and Ruslan Varga never admitted it. By the middle of September, people inside the Society Hill house had begun talking about November, and one Thursday evening, Emmett Kovac and his sister came to dinner to discuss the memorial service. Iona Kovac spoke very little. She was the organization's chief accountant, and she sat at the head of the table with the posture of someone more accustomed to facing numbers than people. Marisol served that dinner, and she did what she had done all her life in other people's rooms. She became invisible, and she watched. Emmett raised his glass toward Ruslan and said that his father would have been proud, that this year they had to do things properly, that 6 families from 3 states had confirmed they would attend, and his voice was warm in the way it had always been warm. Ruslan nodded. Ruslan smiled, just a little, with the rare smile he reserved for only a handful of people in the world. And Marisol, standing 2 steps away with a pitcher of water in her hand, saw what the gray-eyed man sitting 3 feet from Emmett couldn't see. Emmett Kovac's mouth was smiling. His eyes weren't. It wasn't that they were cold. They were calm. They were doing something entirely different from what his mouth was doing, and they continued doing it throughout the meal, steadily, tirelessly. Iona, meanwhile, was counting. Marisol realized it while pouring water for the 2nd time. She counted the chairs. She glanced toward the door leading into the hallway, then toward the door opening onto the back courtyard, then toward the kitchen door. She looked at the 2 men standing outside on the porch, and Marisol saw her chin move slightly. Once for each man. Women counted risks, men counted opportunities, and inside that room that evening, the Kovac siblings were counting 2 different things about the same ceremony. After the gates had closed behind their car, Marisol stood in the quiet kitchen, her hands trembling slightly against the counter. For 2 months, she had kept those terrifying fragments locked away in her mind, paralyzed by the fear of being found out in a house where people disappeared without a sound, and unsure if the gray-eyed boss was any better than the monster plotting against him. But seeing the cold calculation in the Kovacs' eyes tonight changed everything. She knew she could no longer afford the luxury of her silence. With a deep breath, she went upstairs to the study and knocked on the door. She repeated every word. She added nothing. She left nothing out. She didn't tell him what she thought. She told him only what she had heard, the 3 fragments that had drifted through the crack in the door on that sweltering July afternoon, and the word that sounded like the name of a flower. Ruslan Varga listened to everything without interrupting her once. Then he folded his arms. Then he asked, very quietly, so quietly that she had to strain to hear him just as she had strained to hear him in the basement. Do you understand what I'll be forced to do to you if you're wrong? Marisol didn't lower her eyes. I do. I'm still telling you. He remained silent for a long time after that, long enough for her to hear the clock on the mantel. Then he spoke, and there wasn't the slightest trace of anger in his voice, only something ancient and weary. Emmett Kovac held me in his arms when I was 5. He taught me how to tie my shoes. When my father was lying there and I couldn't read a single line, he was the one who stood up and delivered the eulogy. And he finished it, even though his voice broke 3 times. In my world, Miss Quintero, people don't poison the men who sit and eat at their table. Marisol started to speak again. He raised one hand, only slightly, and she fell silent. But Ruslan Varga wasn't a fool, and this was the moment he would return to again and again during the 36 months he later spent in a room with a high window. He didn't dismiss what she had told him. He believed she had heard the words correctly. He simply didn't believe she had heard the right man. In his mind, the only reasonable explanation was that someone outside the organization was planning something for November, that Emmett had somehow learned about it, and that she had overheard him discussing it with someone, and in a dark hallway with a door standing half an inch ajar, every man's voice sounded the same. That night, he called Solomon Pike and ordered him to investigate every crew in North Philadelphia, every meeting, every unusual expenditure, every unfamiliar name that had appeared near the docks during the previous 3 months. He ordered the work done quietly. He ordered that no one be told. And that was the only thing he could do, because within the Varga organization, every report passed across the consigliere's desk before reaching the boss. Every expenditure, every file, every name. Emmett Kovac didn't need to be suspected to know that someone was hunting him. He only needed to read on Monday morning, as he had been reading for 20 years. Ruslan Varga wasn't blind. He was simply looking in the wrong direction, and the man standing beside him, pointing toward North Philadelphia, handing him spotless reports and a peppermint, was the very man he was searching for. While the spotless reports on the North Philly cruise began piling up on Solomon Pike's desk, Marisol Quintero continued taking the familiar bus route back to Kensington every Saturday, and it was the only thing in her life that never changed. Delphina lived in a ground-floor apartment whose rent her daughter paid with the 2 hands she used to scrub floors, with a machine running day and night in the corner and a clear tube stretching from it to her nose. Her memory came and went like a radio searching for a signal it couldn't hold. Some days, she could recount her wedding and remember the name of every guest. Other days, she couldn't remember what day of the week it was. Marisol had learned how to live inside both kinds of days without correcting her mother. Then, on a Saturday in early October, Delphina stared at her for a long time, long enough that Marisol set down her cup of tea. Then she smiled, a warm and entirely genuine smile, and called her Rosita. Rosita, you've grown so tall. What have you been eating to grow so tall? Then she looked around the room and asked where her sister was, why her sister hadn't come home to visit her, whether she was very busy. Marisol sat motionless in the chair beside her mother's bed, inside the room filled with the machine's steady hum, and played the part of her own sleeping younger sister. She's busy working, Mama. She'll be home soon. Delphina nodded, satisfied, and said that girl had always worked too much. Then she fell asleep. Marisol cleared away the cup, turned off the bedside lamp, and stepped into the apartment hallway. She stood there with her back against the blue-painted wall and cried without making a sound, because she was afraid her mother might hear, and she had cried that way so many times in her life that her body had become very good at it, without letting a single sound escape. She had been erased from the world by the woman who had given birth to her. The next 3 weeks passed inside the dense silence that had settled over the Society Hill house. Then, on a Saturday near the end of October, Marisol opened the apartment door and knew immediately that something was wrong. Not because of a sound, because of the smell, because of the way Delphina's head rested at an angle against the pillow. She called to her mother. Delphina answered with a faint murmur, her eyes barely open, not fully conscious, the edges of her lips turning blue. Marisol crossed the room, and she didn't look at her mother first. She looked at the pressure gauge on the machine. She had studied thousands of gauges like that during 3 years of nursing lectures and night shifts, and she recognized the discrepancy within 2 seconds. The tank wasn't empty. It was full. The regulator valve had been turned down until it was almost closed, allowing only a thread of air through, so thin that it was nearly useless, and it had remained that way all night, while her mother lay there slipping slowly into respiratory failure for hours as Marisol folded towels inside a house 4 miles away. She opened the valve. She called an ambulance. She propped up the pillows and raised her mother into a sitting position. Delphina lived. Solomon Pike reached the hospital before Ruslan did. He worked for 2 days, and what he found was worse than finding nothing at all. The medical equipment company said one of its technicians had arrived for a routine inspection on Thursday evening, had taken the measurements, and had signed the form. The signature was forged. The real technician had been at home that day, given time off because the schedule had changed at the last moment. The camera in the apartment hallway lost its signal for one brief stretch that night, then returned to normal. No suspect, no fingerprints, nothing at all. And the valve was only a valve. Anyone in the world would have called it a mechanical failure. Ruslan Varga arrived on Monday evening. He didn't enter the room. He stood in the hallway, looking through the glass at the elderly woman lying inside with the clear tube running to her nose. And he remained there for a very long time. Then he spoke without turning his head. "Someone has just spoken to me in a language I understand." He said nothing more. He didn't ask whether Marisol was all right. He didn't ask for her opinion. The following morning, Delphina was moved to a private room on the floor above, with a nurse beside her day and night, and 2 men sitting outside in the hallway, taking turns watching the door, and not a single bill ever reached Marisol's hands. She reminded him, very gently, without the slightest accusation in her voice, that this was exactly what she had warned him about on that September night. This time, he didn't dismiss her, but he still didn't look in the direction he needed to look. He merely tightened the circle around every door in his life, the doors of his house, his car, and the hospital, and he assigned men to guard them all. He forgot only one thing. The man hunting him didn't need to break through any door. He had a key. The circle around Ruslan Varga's doors had been tightened for exactly 9 days when the letter arrived. It lay among the mail delivered to the harbor office, without a stamp, without a postmark, with only his name typed across the envelope. Inside was a sheet of paper and 3 photographs. The paper said that the woman caring for his house was an informant for the North Philly crew, that she had been planted there from the beginning, that she was being paid in cash every month, and that the boss should ask himself why everything had started immediately after she walked through his door. The 3 photographs showed Marisol Quintero sitting in a cafe in Kensington, across from a man in a gray coat, and in the final photograph, she was accepting a thick envelope from his hand. In Ruslan Varga's world, an accusation like that didn't lead to a search. It led to a body in the trunk of a car, and it led there very quickly, and no one asked a second question. Solomon Pike knew that. Ruslan knew that, and both men understood that if the boss pushed the letter aside and did nothing, the 40 men would reach only one conclusion, that the woman was being protected, and once they believed that, they would handle the problem in their own way, on some evening, in some place, without telling anyone. So Pike searched her room. He did it on Tuesday afternoon, and he apologized before he began, and Marisol saw something on the face of that 55-year-old man that was almost shame. 3 men turned over everything she owned in this world, and it took less than 15 minutes, because everything she owned in this world consisted of 1 cloth suitcase, a tin box filled with loose change, several changes of clothes, an unfinished diploma inside a plastic sleeve, and an old telephone that had stopped working long ago, the kind with a pink plastic case and large buttons. One of the 3 men picked up the telephone and turned it over in his hand. Put it down. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't rise by a single note, but the man stopped halfway through the motion, looked at her, and placed the telephone gently back on the dresser, exactly where it had been. It was Rosita's toy telephone, and Marisol had continued paying for that number for 8 years, every month, without missing once, only because the voicemail still held a greeting recorded in a child's voice, the only thing that remained from before the night of March 14th. As for the thick envelope in the photograph, the truth was so simple that it was cruel. It contained overdue bills from the care facility where her sister lay, and the man in the gray coat was the debt collector they had sent to meet her, and the envelope was thick because it held copies of 11 months of late payments. The photograph was real. The people were real. The place was real. Only the story had been invented. That night, Marisol sat on the bed inside the room that had just been torn apart and stared at the cloth suitcase for nearly an hour. She packed her belongings in her mind 3 times. And the reason she stayed wasn't courage, wasn't loyalty, wasn't any noble determination. The reason she stayed was that if she walked out through those gates that night, then by morning her mother would lose the private room, lose the nurse beside her day and night, lose the 2 men sitting outside in the hallway, and her sister would lose the bed in the place with windows overlooking a row of trees. That was all. She put her belongings back into the closet. The following morning, Ruslan found her in the kitchen and apologized, and that was something he had almost never done with anyone still alive. Marisol poured his coffee and answered in her usual steady voice, "You had to let them search. If you hadn't, they would have believed you were protecting me. Then they would have found another way, on some night when you weren't home. And the other way wouldn't have been nearly this polite." Ruslan Varga stood motionless with the coffee cup in his hand and watched the woman wiping down the table, and in that moment he understood something that sent a chill down his spine in a way no gun ever had. She had thought 3 moves ahead of him. She had calculated the entire situation before the letter had even arrived. And if she could see that much, then what she had heard through the door, standing half an inch ajar on that July afternoon, might have been more accurate than he wanted to believe. What Ruslan Varga had just understood in the kitchen that morning had been understood long ago by someone else in the city, and that person decided it was time to have a conversation. 3 nights later, Marisol left her mother's hospital room at nearly 11 o'clock and took the west elevator down to the parking garage, the same elevator she used every evening because it was closer to the bus stop. On the 3rd floor, the doors opened, and a man stepped inside. He was around 50, wearing a dark coat, with nothing in his hands. He didn't look at her. He stood in the opposite corner, facing the doors, like anyone else inside a hospital elevator at 11 o'clock at night. The doors closed. The elevator descended. As they neared the 1st floor, he reached toward the control panel and pressed the stop button, and the entire metal box shuddered to a halt between 2 floors with a faint vibration. Then he turned toward her and asked in the tone someone might use to ask the time, "Why do you keep hospital papers, Miss Quintero? People throw them away. They only keep them when they want to remember something." Marisol didn't answer. She stood motionless, feeling the weight of the cloth bag on her shoulder, the bag containing the stack of papers on whose blank backs she had been writing dates, times, and every word she heard. The man didn't move closer. He didn't put his hand into his pocket. He simply continued, and his voice grew warmer, almost considerate. "Mr. Kovac is concerned about you. He asked me to tell you that he knows about Maid. Medication drawer number 4, 3 o'clock in the morning. He even knows you took it home to your mother and didn't sell a single pill, and he says that was the act of a devoted daughter, not a thief. He has put that file away. No one needs to know, ever, as long as you remain where you belong." For the next 14 seconds, neither person inside that metal box said a word. Marisol didn't scream. She didn't step back. She looked at him and spoke in her usual steady voice. "You aren't going to do anything to me. If you were, you wouldn't be talking. People don't talk first." He tilted his head slightly, looking genuinely curious. "How can you be certain?" "Because the camera in this elevator is still working. I check it every night before I step inside. It's a habit learned by someone who once lived in a building with a broken fire alarm." The man watched her for another second. Then he nodded very slightly, as though she had just answered a question he had carried with him before entering the elevator. He reached out and pressed the release button, and the elevator descended the short distance that remained, and the doors slid open. Before stepping out, he paused for exactly 1 beat. "Your mother is breathing more easily this week. That's good. Keep things exactly as they are." Then he walked away, and the sound of his shoes faded into the parking garage. Marisol remained inside that metal box until the doors closed on their own, and while she stood there, the entire shape of the plan unfolded before her, clean and complete, like a map someone had just spread across a table. They weren't going to kill her. They had never intended to kill her. They needed her alive. They needed her to remain inside that house, to keep her ring of keys, to keep standing 2 steps away from the boss. Because on some November evening, when Ruslan Varga collapsed on his way home from a heart attack, there would be only one question, and the answer had already been written months before. A woman with a criminal conviction for taking medication. A woman who had never finished nursing school, who understood drugs, understood dosages, and even knew the names of things that sounded like flowers. A woman who held the keys to every door in the house, and whom the boss trusted in a way unusual enough that all 40 of his men had noticed. The Maid file wasn't a threat. It was a bullet that had been resting in the chamber for a long time, and tonight someone had merely stopped by to show it to her. If she spoke again, she would become the suspect. If she remained silent, her employer would die. 4 days later, a local newspaper published an investigation into the Sandor Fund, citing an anonymous source with intimate knowledge of the organization and presenting figures that accused Ruslan Varga himself of draining the fund that carried his father's name. He didn't sleep for 3 days, traveling across the city to reassure union leaders, while Solomon Pike's forces were split in half, one half dealing with the real threat, the other dealing with a scandal that had never existed. While Ruslan Varga raced across the city trying to extinguish a fire that didn't exist, the Kovac siblings sat facing each other on 2 plastic chairs inside a rented office in Fishtown, its curtains drawn in the middle of the day, and discussed November. Iona wanted to postpone. She spoke in the voice of someone who had finished counting and didn't like the final number. 200 guests. 6 families. 3 local television stations had requested permission to film outside. 3 security cameras inside the church itself. Not counting the telephones in the pockets of 200 people, she said there were quieter evenings, emptier roads, cleaner ways, and that nothing would be lost by waiting another few months. Emmett Kovac listened to everything. He never interrupted his sister. Then he took a peppermint from his coat pocket, peeled away the shiny wrapper, placed it in his mouth, and spoke the sentence that contained the whole of who he was. When a man dies in the dark, people investigate. They ask who benefits. They open the books. They call the federal authorities. When a man dies in front of 200 people in a cross, people weep. They embrace on the church steps. They write very long obituaries. And no one in this world performs an autopsy on a broken heart, Iona. When a 34-year-old man collapses after reading a eulogy for his father, it isn't a criminal case, it's a sad story. Iona Kovac fell silent. She nodded once, very slightly, and within that single nod lay the entire remainder of this story. That afternoon, inside the same room, Emmett Kovac met a man named Bartek Nowicki, 29 years old, a banquet server. He worked shifts for event companies around Center City, carrying trays, pouring wine, leaning against walls in rooms to which he would never be invited. He had a young daughter, and her name was sitting on a waiting list, and that list didn't move at the speed of the human heart. It moved at the speed of chance. His wife had left more than a year earlier, because there were burdens not everyone could carry, and he didn't blame her. He hadn't blamed her for a single day, and the debt had no bottom. It was no longer a number, it was a well. Emmett Kovac didn't threaten him. Threats were the work of men without subtlety. He did something far crueler. He was kind. He poured Bartek a cup of coffee. He asked where he had driven from, whether traffic had been heavy, whether he had eaten. He didn't ask a single question about Bartek's daughter. He didn't mention the hospital. He didn't say the child's name, didn't say what illness she had, didn't speak a single word that touched the deepest wound, and that was precisely how Bartek Nowicki understood that this man knew everything. Then Emmett placed an envelope on the table. I know you need a large sum of money. I'm not asking why. Your affairs are your own. There's enough in here that you won't have to be afraid every time your telephone rings. He pushed the envelope a little closer to Bartek with 2 fingertips. All you have to do is carry one particular glass, to one particular man, at one particular moment. Someone will tell you when. You don't ask, you don't look, you don't remember. Then he spoke the final sentence, and he said it in the voice of a kindly uncle helping his nephew out of trouble. You aren't a murderer, Bartek. You're a server. What guilt could there be in serving? Bartek Nowicki stared at the envelope on the table for a long time. Something inside his mind was screaming, and he could hear it clearly, telling him to stand up, walk out of that room with its closed curtains right now, ask no questions, and never return. But something else inside his mind was counting. It counted the months. It counted the calls from the hospital billing office. It counted the nights he had sat in his car outside the parking lot, too afraid to go inside because he no longer knew what to say to anyone. Desperation had its own particular way of silencing a conscience. It didn't argue. It merely waited. It waited the way a person waited for water to boil. Bartek picked up the envelope. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in his rented room staring at the ceiling and told himself again and again that he was only carrying a glass of wine, that when someone told a server to carry something, he carried it, that if anything was wrong he would still have time to stop, that he would know. Surely he would know. He was almost as skilled at lying as Marisol Quintero. There was only one difference. She lied to save a woman who was slowly forgetting her own daughter. He was lying to himself. Solomon Pike reviewed the service staff roster on Monday morning of Memorial Week, and he did it exactly the way a man who had worn a police uniform for 18 years still did everything. Slowly, dryly, without overlooking a single line. The catering company submitted several dozen names. He checked each one against identification records, every date of birth, every address, every place each person had worked during the previous 3 years. The list was clean. He signed it, and he slept well that Monday night. Perhaps the last night he would sleep well for many months. On Wednesday morning, an updated document was submitted to the office. It arrived through the usual channels, with a note explaining that the catering company had made a last-minute staffing change because one employee had called in sick, and in the lower right corner of the page were the initials of the consigliere, the signature Solomon Pike had seen on thousands of documents throughout all the years he had worked for the Varga family. He didn't review it again. Not because he was lazy, because within the entire structure of that world, there wasn't a single reason for a sane man to question that signature. One line among dozens, one name replacing another, while the man who had been replaced sat at home with just enough cash to believe he had been lucky. On Thursday afternoon, Marisol saw him for the first time. The catering company brought the glassware to the church, so it could be counted in advance, and a young man carried a crate down from the truck and placed it on the steps. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. He answered the manager's questions with nods, and when he set the crate down, his hands trembled, a very slight tremor that only someone who had worked night shifts in a hospital would recognize, the trembling of a body that hadn't slept for many nights. Then he straightened and pulled down his sleeve, and in the half-second before the fabric covered it, Marisol saw a paper wristband around his wrist. She recognized it immediately, without needing to think, the way a person recognized her mother's voice in a crowd. It was the kind of wristband given to the families of hospitalized patients, the kind she herself had worn for the past 8 years. One after another, week after week, in a place with windows overlooking a row of trees. She stood motionless. She didn't understand why it sent a chill down her spine. It was only a paper wristband. Half the city had someone they loved in a hospital, but the cold still traveled along her spine. And that evening she took out an old bill, turned it over, and wrote on the back, date, time, one banquet server, brown hair, trembling hands, wearing a hospital wristband. She didn't know why she wrote it down. She simply did. On Thursday night, she begged him to postpone the ceremony. She waited until the house was empty, then told him everything she had, about the elevator, about the man in the dark coat, about the words saying her mother was breathing more easily that week. Ruslan Varga listened. Then he shook his head. 6 families from 3 states have been invited, Miss Quintero. Some people will fly here, some will travel 8 hours by road to stand inside that church. If I postpone it, they won't think I'm being cautious. They'll think I'm afraid. And in my world, fear is blood in the water. It only takes 1 drop. And by morning, everything I've built over 10 years will have people coming to test it with their teeth. Marisol looked at him and asked the question she would remember forever. So you would rather die on schedule than live after being late? He didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window toward the rooftops of the city where his father had died in a parking lot in broad daylight, while no one agreed to testify. I would rather die as my father's son. And that was when Marisol Quintero said the cruelest thing she had ever said to anyone in her life. Do you think I've stayed here because I'm loyal? Do you think I stand in your kitchen at midnight arguing with you because I care about you? I stay because my mother breathes with your money. Because my sister lies in a bed you pay for. If you die, I lose all of that within a week. Don't mistake desperation for loyalty, sir. When she finished, she walked out of the room, and Ruslan Varga remained alone in the darkness for a very long time. 2 nights later, inside a church filled with candlelight, that same woman would sacrifice everything she had just named to prove that every word of it had been a lie. 40 hands remained inside 40 coats, and not a single person inside St. Adalbert Church breathed. An order as ancient as anything in that room was at work, older than the building itself, and it was waiting only for a nod. Then footsteps sounded on the stone steps. Father Absalom Renner was 66 years old, and he had buried members of this family for more than half his life. He descended from the altar slowly, both hands hanging at his sides inside the sleeves of his black vestments, and walked straight toward Marisol Quintero, who stood there with one hand still numb and stinging, and he stopped in front of her. He said nothing. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't pray. He simply stood there between that woman and 40 men, an old man dressed in black standing in the center aisle of his own church. And years later, after Ruslan Varga had told this story many times to many people, he always stopped at this exact moment, and he always said the same thing, that if the priest hadn't stepped down from the altar, he would have nodded. Not because he wanted to, because in his world, that nod was automatic, like breathing, and it was already lodged in his throat. The 3 seconds that old man bought for him were 3 seconds he didn't deserve. He knew it then. He knew it for the rest of his life. And during those 3 seconds, Emmett Kovash spoke. He didn't panic. He never panicked. He stepped forward, placed one hand on Ruslan's shoulder, and spoke in the warm voice the entire church could hear. The voice of an uncle taking a difficult burden from his nephew. Ruslan, the girl just struck you. In front of 6 families. In your father's church. Before his photograph. I know you care about her. I know. But look around you. If you let this pass, by tomorrow morning there won't be anyone left in this city who fears you. And you know what comes after that. She's crazy, Ruslan. She claims she just saved your life from poison, but she's nothing but a liar trying to humiliate you. Give her to me. I'll clear this mess up. And inside St. Adalbert Church on that November morning, Emmett Kovac was completely right. That was the cruelest part. By every unwritten law of that world, every word he had just spoken was true. And all 40 men knew it was true. And Marisol Quintero, standing behind an elderly priest, knew it was true as well. Ruslan Varga didn't answer. He lifted one hand to his cheek, where the marks of 5 fingers were still visible, then looked down at the stone floor, at the red pool, spreading among the shattered pieces of crystal. He stared at it for a long time. Then he raised his head and asked Emmett Kovac a question in the quietest voice anyone had ever heard him use. Emmett. Marisol ran across the room and slapped me without saying a single word. She hasn't spoken to anyone in this church since she got here, so tell me, how did you know she was claiming the wine was poisoned? Silence. Not the silence of a room, the silence of something that had just broken. Because Ruslan Varga hadn't heard the truth. He had seen it. During all the time since the wine glass shattered against the stone, every one of the 200 people inside that church had looked down at the floor. Every single one of them. People always looked. It was what the body did on its own when something broke at its feet. Only one person inside St. Adalbert Church hadn't glanced down even once. And that person stood half a step away with one hand resting on Ruslan's shoulder. An innocent man looked. A man who already knew didn't need to. Solomon. Seal the church. No one leaves. Not even him. What followed were the 2 longest hours in the history of that church. No one was allowed to leave their seat. Every shard of crystal was collected with forceps. The pool of wine was absorbed with gauze and sealed inside a vial. 3 television stations stood outside on the church steps and were told nothing beyond a brief statement about a minor security incident. Bartek Nowicki sat inside a locked room at the back with his head in his hands. Emmett Kovac sat in the 3rd pew with both hands resting neatly on his lap, and he didn't speak another word to anyone. Marisol was taken into the sacristy, and the door closed behind her. The toxicology laboratory ran the standard panel twice to be certain. They screened for everything people commonly used to kill one another in that state. The substances named in textbooks, the substances that had appeared in criminal cases before. The results came back 2 hours later. Negative. There was nothing in the glass of wine. Nothing at all. Solomon Pike read the paper twice before handing it to Ruslan, and Ruslan read it 3 times. And for the next 40 minutes, Marisol Quintero was a madwoman who had slapped the boss of the Varga family inside a church, in front of 6 families, over nothing. Those 40 minutes were the longest 40 minutes of Marisol Quintero's life, and she lived every one of them on a wooden chair inside the sacristy, both hands resting on her lap, her right hand still numb from the wrist down to the tips of her fingers. Through the thick wooden door, she could hear voices outside. Not the words, only the rhythm, and she knew where that rhythm was leading. She heard someone laugh, a brief sound filled with relief, and she understood that they had just been told there was nothing in the glass. She remained still. She had lived long enough and close enough to the edge to understand exactly what was being decided beyond that door, and she knew which door would open, and who would walk through it, and that person wouldn't raise his voice, because men like that never raise their voices. She thought of her mother. She thought of the private room upstairs with 2 men sitting outside in the hallway, and she wondered how many days would pass before they were withdrawn. She thought of the bed in the place with windows overlooking a row of trees. Then she stood. She didn't go looking for Solomon Pike. She knew exactly what her value was inside that building at that moment, and that value was nothing. And a person worth nothing couldn't give orders to any laboratory. She went looking for the only person inside St. Adalbert Church whom no one dared contradict. Father Absalom Renner was standing alone beside a low table in the vesting room, and he turned when she entered. And he didn't ask what she wanted. He simply waited. Marisol spoke quickly, clearly, without a single unnecessary word. The panel they just ran only screens for the things people usually use to kill one another. The things named in books. The things that have appeared in criminal cases in this state before. What was in that glass isn't common. It isn't a drug. It's extracted from a flower people plant along fences, because it looks beautiful in summer. The purple flower found in half the gardens in this city. It isn't on the list. The machine won't look for it unless someone specifically asks. Then she spoke the final sentence, and her voice broke only once, on the very first word. Father, tell him. He won't listen to me. The priest looked at her for a long time. He looked into her eyes the way a man who had spent more than 40 years sitting inside confessionals looked, searching for the truth not in the words she spoke but somewhere else, somewhere only men like him knew how to reach. Then he nodded, and he went outside, and he said one sentence to Solomon Pike. No one knew what he said. Pike never told anyone, but Pike picked up the telephone. The second result arrived close to midnight, after every candle in the church had been extinguished, and only the sickly yellow ceiling lights remained. Akhenaten, the medical examiner, came in person to deliver the news, because some things weren't said over the telephone, and he stood in the middle of the empty church, holding the paper in his hand, and he explained the cruelest part of the entire story, in the calm voice of a man who had done this work for far too long. It doesn't kill immediately. That's the beautiful part. It gives a person 10, perhaps 15 minutes. He would drain the glass of wine before his father's altar, then stand there and shake every guest's hand, thank each one of them, walk out to the steps, and get into the car, and he would collapse on the way home, miles from this place, inside a moving vehicle, with none of those 200 people present to witness it. No one would connect the two events because they wouldn't happen in the same place. Someone would call an ambulance. Someone would fill out the paperwork, and every autopsy report in this state would contain the same line, "Gentlemen." A 34-year-old man had just finished delivering a eulogy for his father when his heart stopped. No one, not a single person in this world, would think to look for a flower. Ruslan Varga lowered himself onto the nearest chair, very slowly. The way a person sat down when his legs could no longer hold him. He stared at his hands, the same hands that had held the stem of that crystal glass less than 3 hours earlier, and the slap that had echoed through that church. The slap 200 people had taken for insolence. The slap 40 men had been prepared to repay with a life. Hadn't been insolence at all. It had been the shortest distance that could possibly exist in this world between Ruslan Varga and a death someone had carefully wrapped in grief. Bartek Nowicki broke in less than an hour, and no one had to lay a hand on him. Solomon Pike sat down across from him in the small room behind the church, placed the test result on the table, turned it around so Bartek could read it, then spoke in the dry voice of a man who had worn a uniform for 18 years. You nearly killed him with something extracted from a flower. Your daughter is waiting to be saved by something else. Sit there and think about that. Then he fell silent. He didn't threaten him. He didn't make promises. He simply sat there and allowed the silence to finish the work. And inside that room, Bartek Nowicki collapsed across the table and wept the way a grown man wept only once in his life. He confessed everything. He told them about the room with the closed curtains in Fishtown. He told them about the envelope. He told them about the words asking what guilt there could be in serving. He said Emmett Kovac's name 3 times, clearly and without hesitation. And each time he finished saying it, he apologized, though no one in the room knew whom he was apologizing to. Then Pike asked the final question, the one he had saved, the one he had been thinking about for the entire hour. Who gave you the vial? Bartek looked up, his eyes bloodshot, and gave an answer no one in that room had been prepared to hear. It wasn't Mr. Kovac. He never gave me anything except the envelope. It was a woman. She came to the place where I worked, dressed neatly, and said she was from the hospital, there to ask whether my family needed any additional support. She was very kind. She asked me several questions about the paperwork. Then, when she stood up to leave, she placed the vial on the table and said Mr. Kovac had sent it. She didn't say another word. Solomon Pike put down his pen. During all the months he had spent examining the North Philly crew, he had never once written that name on paper. No one had. Iona Kovac was the chief accountant. She never touched cash. She was never present anywhere at the moment someone needed to be present. She was the woman who sat at the end of the table and counted the exits. And that was precisely why she was the only person in the world Emmett Kovac trusted with that small glass vial. Because careful people never dropped anything. And because she was his sister. And in that world, blood remained the final thing people trusted. 3 days after the ceremony, just as Marisol Quintero stepped out of her mother's apartment on a Tuesday morning, 2 Philadelphia police cars pulled up in front of the building. They arrested her on the sidewalk in Kensington, in front of neighbors who had known her since she was a child. The charge was conspiracy to poison Ruslan Varga. The foundation for it had been prepared with great care by someone and delivered at exactly the right moment. A Belmead file. 3 years in nursing lecture halls and a woman who knew precisely what the substance in the glass was called before the laboratory did. A ring of keys that opened every door in the house. And an anonymous statement. Emmett Kovac no longer needed to kill Ruslan Varga. He had lost that move on the stone floor of St. Adalbert Church. He needed only one thing now. To turn the woman who was about to take the witness stand into someone no one would believe, and he possessed exactly what he needed to do it. And he had kept it hidden for months while waiting for this day. Ruslan Varga posted her bail that afternoon, in cash, carried inside a cloth bag no one bothered to ask about. He waited for her outside the police station gates without a suit, and when she stepped into the November afternoon light, he said one thing to her, and those words changed the entire remainder of his life. I have 40 men, and a gun for every one of them. I have money hidden inside the walls of my house. I have my name. This morning, I stood over there and realized that not one of those things could get you out of that building. Only a lawyer could do that. Then he looked at her and continued more quietly. Do you understand what that means to a man like me? And for the first time in all 34 years of his life, Ruslan Varga needed the very thing he had spent his entire life despising. The lawyer needed the books. And to obtain the books, Solomon Pike had to go back through 20 years of records. And while searching through them, he found a name no one had thought about in a very long time. Odile was 74 years old and lived in a small house in Allentown with a patch of garden behind it and several pots of tomatoes. She invited Pike inside, poured tea, and when he asked about her knees, she looked down at her hands for a long time. Her knees were fine. They were strong enough for her to walk 3 blocks to the bakery every morning. 2 years earlier, while cleaning the study, she had seen papers she wasn't supposed to see, and she had read them, and afterward she had sat in the kitchen for an entire night. She had meant to speak. She swore to Pike that she had meant to speak. Then, on Friday afternoon, Emmett Kovac came to visit her. He brought a bag of peppermints and sat with her in the kitchen, and he asked about her son who worked in a warehouse outside Baltimore, asked how the job had been lately, asked whether the boy's back still hurt. Then he asked what grade her granddaughter was in that year, and he said the child's name correctly without needing a moment to remember. He didn't threaten her. He didn't say a single word that could have been recorded and used against him. He merely patted the back of her hand and spoke in the warmest voice in the world. Your knees haven't been doing very well lately, have they? You should rest, Odile. Ruslan will take care of you. That evening, Odile wrote the letter, and the following morning, she never returned. When Pike asked why she had remained silent for 2 years, she didn't explain, didn't defend herself, didn't cry. She simply looked at him and said one thing. I have a granddaughter. Do you? It meant that Ruslan Varga had nearly been warned 2 years earlier, and the thing that had silenced that warning wasn't fear. It was a bag of peppermints and a question about a child's grade at school, and that was when the entire shape of Emmett Kovac emerged, clean and complete. He didn't buy evil people. Evil people were expensive. Evil people betrayed you. Evil people talked too much. He bought good people, and he bought them with the very thing they loved most. Odile with her granddaughter, Bartek Nowicki with his daughter, and inside a metal box suspended between 2 hospital floors, he had almost bought Marisol Quintero with a mother who was breathing more easily that week. The books were worse than anything Ruslan had imagined. The Sandor Fund had been drained for years. False invoices, false patients, names that had never existed placed beside the names of real people, and buried among those papers were rejected applications, hundreds of them, written by hand by men who had submitted them and waited, and some of those men had died while they waited, while their own money sat untouched in an account in Delaware. Then Solomon Pike placed a yellowed application in front of Ruslan, and Ruslan read the name written upon it, and for a very long time, he couldn't speak. Quintero, Delfina, the wife of a dock worker who had died in a fire in Kensington. An application for assistance with a breathing machine, submitted many years earlier, stamped denied by a hand that had signed thousands of documents inside that house. Marisol had never known her father had applied. Ruslan had never known the application existed. The fund he had created to save families like hers had been stolen by the very man who would later hire someone to place a flower in his wine glass. Within the organization, no one doubted what would happen next. 40 men were waiting. They wouldn't ask a single question. That was how everything had always been settled, and it was fast, and it was clean, and it would be finished in one night. Marisol went upstairs to the study that evening. Your father died because no one agreed to testify. If you deal with him in the dark, you'll kill the testimony too. 300 families will never hear their names read aloud in court. My mother will never know that her husband once wrote an application. Ruslan Varga looked at her. You're telling me to hand him over to the law. The law punished the man who allowed that entire building to burn with a fine equal to the price of an old car. Yes, she said. And I lived with that number for 8 years. But do you know why he escaped? Because no one testified that day. This time, I will. And Ruslan Varga sat motionless inside his study, and what he remembered wasn't the church, wasn't the wine glass, wasn't the yellowed application. He remembered a glass of water being placed in front of him in the kitchen on a night near the end of August, and a woman telling him that the easy way was always the way of a lazy man. Ruslan Varga didn't hand his organization over to anyone, because doing that meant death, and he knew he wouldn't survive long enough to reach the trial. He handed over exactly one thing. He handed over the fund that bore his father's name. Acting as its founder, he personally filed a petition requesting a criminal investigation of Emmett Kovac for embezzling money from a charitable organization, a case entirely separate from everything else Ruslan had ever done in his life. And the price was exactly what the lawyer had warned him it would be during their first meeting. Once the fund's books were opened, people would see everything inside them, including the pages showing how Ruslan himself had used it to clean some of his money during the early years. He pleaded guilty to tax fraud and laundering money through a non-profit organization. 36 months in federal prison. As part of the plea agreement, he surrendered control of the harbor, and the cruelest price wasn't written on any document. The other families called him the man who had broken the law by which all of them lived, the man who had once ruled the waters of Philadelphia the way weather ruled a coastline entered prison without a single friend left behind him. At the trial, Iona Kovac testified first. The cautious ones always testified first. Within 48 hours, she sat down with the prosecutor and sold her brother in the flat, even voice of someone reading a balance sheet. Marisol Quintero took the witness stand on the 4th day. Emmett's lawyer rose and did what any good lawyer would have done. You were a housekeeper, weren't you, Miss Quintero? Not an investigator, not a doctor. You didn't even have a nursing license. You were the woman who cleaned the floors. Yes, sir, she answered. Then she turned toward the jury and looked directly at them. The woman who cleaned the floors was the only person in that house who had nothing to lose by telling the truth. That was why I saw what the people in suits couldn't see. They were too busy watching one another. Emmett Kovac received a long sentence. Iona received a shorter one in exchange for her cooperation. Bartek Nowicki and the others who had been bought were given reduced sentences because they testified fully. All of Emmett's assets were seized and returned to the fund he had spent so many years hollowing out. When Ruslan was released from prison, he didn't rebuild anything. He kept exactly one thing, the fund. And he changed its name. It didn't bear his name. It didn't bear his father's name. The Rosita Quintero Fund, named for a little girl who had slept for 8 years after a fire in a building with a broken alarm, whose owner had been required to pay no more than the price of an old car. The fund had 3 branches. Medical expenses for workers' families. No questions, no interest. Exactly as the old one-line rule had promised. Scholarships for people forced to abandon their education because they had stayed behind to care for someone they loved. What Marisol called scholarships for those who had to leave halfway through. And free fire alarm inspections for every low-income apartment building in Kensington and Port Richmond. Forever. Ruslan didn't pay her tuition. He did something more expensive and more difficult. Exactly as she had taught him in the kitchen that night. He hired lawyers to petition for the expungement of her Belmead conviction, a process that took more than a year and cost more than all 4 years of school combined. Marisol Quintero earned her nursing degree at the age of 29. She became the first recipient of that scholarship, and later the woman who ran it, and she personally interviewed the first group of applicants, and in those trembling handshakes, she recognized the woman she had once been, pushing a mop across an emergency room floor at 2 o'clock in the morning. Bartek Nowicki was released from prison on a spring afternoon, and he drove straight to the school gates, where a little girl came racing toward him. Healthy, her hair tied into 2 pigtails, holding high a picture she had just finished drawing in kindergarten so she could show it to her father. With the recovered money, Rosita was transferred to the finest rehabilitation facility in the state, a place with bright hallways and wide windows. She was 17 years old. One afternoon, Marisol sat beside her sister's bed and told her stories, just as she had done for 10 years, and Rosita gently squeezed her sister's hand. One movement, only one. After 10 years, Marisol didn't call anyone. She remained still, holding that hand, and cried in front of her sister for the first time. Delfina, now receiving proper treatment, sat in the front row at the graduation ceremony. She was more confused than before. She no longer remembered everything. But when Marisol stepped onto the stage, Delfina turned to the person sitting beside her and spoke clearly, with pride. "That's my daughter, my oldest daughter." And Marisol, standing on the stage, nodded, because for the first time in 11 years, she didn't have to lie. At the fund's first anniversary celebration, Ruslan Varga, now the boss of nothing at all, stood in the middle of a room filled with people who had once needed saving, raised his glass, and turned toward her. "You warned me, for 4 months, and I told you people didn't poison those who ate at their table." Marisol shook her head very slightly. "I wasn't hired to agree with you, sir. I was hired to care for your house." Then, more softly, so only he could hear, that day, caring for your house simply meant caring for you. Ruslan Varga never forgot the sound of that slap echoing through St. Adalbert Church. He told the story many times in the years that followed, but he never told it as a story about dangerous men, or a flower, or prison. He told it as proof that the people the world overlooked most easily, the people who scrubbed floors, the people who carried trays, the people who stood silently in the corners of rooms, were sometimes the only ones still truly paying attention, while everyone else was too busy applauding themselves. And perhaps that is what this story wishes to leave with us as well, that a person's dignity isn't found in the degree hanging on a wall or the clothes worn to work, but in whether that person dares to speak the truth when no one wants to hear it. That true kindness is usually the harder road, the slower road, the more expensive road, and no one applauds it. That the greatest evil in this world rarely arrives with a cruel face. More often, it comes with a warm smile and a thoughtful question about our children. And that when even one person is willing to stand and testify, only one person, an entire chain of injustice stretching across many years can finally be broken. Please look a little more closely at the people who work quietly around us every day, the cleaners, the servers, the guards at the gate, because they may be paying more attention to us than anyone else. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can continue listening to more compelling stories every day. How do you feel about the story of Marisol and Ruslan? Had you been there, would you have dared to raise your hand inside that church? Please leave a comment below. We truly wish to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.